This is a new show. They asked me to be on this show. It's going to be every Tuesday. It's supposed to be 7 p.m. till 9. Anyway, so let's go. We have Jim Keady on the line, and he's going to give us the latest on the Nike sweatshop actions. Are you there, Jim?
I am here, Catherine. It's great to talk with you again.
So when do you remember when you were on Danny Schechter's radio show? I mean, it's been at least a year, if not more than that.
Yeah, I would say it was about a year ago. What I think would be great is if I could just give a little bit of background for the listeners and how I got involved in this issue.
Exactly.
Back in 1997, I was coaching men's soccer at St. John's University in New York City. At the time, we had one of the top men's soccer programs in the country. The team had won the NCAA Division I National Championship in '96. We were ranked number 2 in the nation in '97. And along with my coaching, I was also pursuing a master's degree in theology at St. John's. And in one of my first classes for my grad degree, I started writing a paper about Nike's labor practices in light of what's called Catholic social teaching. And what I found was if you wanted to pick a company that completely violated everything this body of teaching was about, that Nike would be your perfect case study. And at the same time that I'm learning about how Nike is exploiting mostly poor women in developing countries all around the world, St. John's University Athletic Department started to negotiate a $3.5 million endorsement contract with Nike. And part of that contract would require me as a coach to wear and promote Nike products. And at first, I just quietly challenged this deal. And then eventually I took a stand publicly and I said that I could not be a walking advertisement for a company that's exploiting poor people. And I felt that Nike's actions ran completely counter to everything that our university stood for. And I was told by my head coach and the athletic director, you wear Nike and you drop this issue or you resign. End of story. So in June of 1998, I was forced to resign. I became the first athlete in the world to say no to Nike because of the sweatshop issue. That became big news. It was even bigger news when I filed a lawsuit against St. John's and Nike, and I walked out of the courthouse, and there was ABC, NBC, Fox, and New York Times, all the major radio stations. From the media coverage that I got, I started getting invited to college campuses to do lectures on the issue. And this was back at a time when the sweatshop issue was really just emerging into the American consciousness. You had the Kathy Lee Gifford sweatshop scandal back in '96. The Nike issue was just starting to boil up. So I now became this instant expert on the issue. Right. And when I would go to the colleges and I would start to talk about the issue, the critics in the audience would say to me that I didn't know what I was talking about, that these are economies of scale, that those wages are good for those people in those countries, right. That I just didn't understand international business. Now, I knew from my research and from some time that I had taken traveling around the world back in '93 that my critics were wrong. The athlete in me, the competitor in me, wanted to prove them wrong. So in the summer of 2000, I ended up moving to Indonesia. I moved to Tangerang, Indonesia, which is an industrial suburb outside of the capital of Jakarta. And for 1 month, I lived with Nike factory workers in a village. I tried to live in the conditions that they live in, to survive on the wages that they were paid. Back in 2000, their spending power was about $1.25 a day. And in 1 month, trying to live like a Nike factory worker in a rat-infested slum, I lost 25 pounds. Yeah. And I spent those 30 days meeting the women and the men who made the products that as an athlete I wore for years and I never thought about them. And I promised them, I'll go home, I will advocate for you, we'll try to fight to get you better wages and working conditions. And I thought I was going to do that work for maybe 6, 7, 8 months. And I was doing it full-time for 13 years. And I've just scaled back recently just because of funding issues to doing it part-time, but I'm absolutely committed. And the issues are still there. The same issues that I documented back in 2000 were there in January of 2013 when I was in Indonesia 6 months ago. And there's just a case that I got emailed to me 2 days ago from one of my union contacts there that we need to start advocating on, a union busting case. And you couple that with a case that happened in Cambodia about 2 weeks ago, where you had 3,500 Nike garment workers were protesting, and the police came and they hit women with stun guns, and one of the women lost her 2-month-old baby after being hit with a stun gun. And then you couple that with the situation, the horrific situation in Bangladesh, where you had more than 1,200 workers crushed to death in a factory Now
Right.
those weren't Nike workers, but the issues are the same. This is an industry-wide problem. Well, I have focused on Nike in Indonesia as a case study. Nike. I've interviewed workers that are dealing with the same issues that produce for Nike, Adidas, Reebok, Gap, Old Navy, Tommy Hilfiger, Polo, Ralph Lauren, Lotto, Fila, Levi's, Puma, Asics, Saucony, New Balance, Converse, all the same. You pick a major Western brand, and this is how they are making the clothes and shoes that we purchase as consumers here in the West.
Like, what is their argument? I mean, like, when they try to say that, whatever this 125 is sufficient to be paying these people. I mean, how do they justify it? Like, that's what I just can't understand.
Yeah, they really try to stay away from justifying the wage issue. They simply make the statement that they will pay a wage that is within the parameters of the law. They've said that people in the industry will say, it's really difficult to determine a living wage, and there's all kinds of theories and studies out there, and it needs to be debated. And the example that I give, I still lecture all over the place, and when I speak to high school and college students, I use this example for kids in the United States. I go, look, if I got you a job in New York City, and I said that I'm going to pay you $10,000 a year, could you live comfortably on that in New York City? And any kid that I've ever posed this to says, absolutely not. I said, well, how do you know? And I go, well, it's New York City. It's expensive. I'm going to have to pay this for rent, and this for telephone, and this for transportation, and this for food, and this for clothes. And you go through a very, a modest laundry list of things that you would need to live a relatively modest and comfortable life. Well, you don't need a PhD in economics to figure that out.
Right.
And that's the same thing with Nike factory workers in Indonesia or Vietnam or China. If you ask them what they need to meet their basic living needs without just struggling to survive, going into massive amounts of debt, at times going hungry because they have to make choices between taking care of their kids or eating a proper diet, every worker that I've met will tell you they need approximately 3 times the government mandated minimum wage.
Okay, I have a question. So, I mean, again, it's like a no-brainer, though. We don't want to just pay people. I mean, it seems like they just want to pay these people the absolute bare minimum that they can get away with paying.
That is correct.
I mean, again, like in a Walmart, even in the United States, people don't even make that much, but the idea is, I mean, people want to grow. I mean, you want to be able to grow and get somewhere in life. You don't want to just be staying in these slave jobs forever. And if you're just getting paid, $1.25 an hour, I mean, even if it is in Indonesia where, the wages or the standard of living is different than it is here in the United States. I mean, you still want to be able to have a little bit of elbow room, and move up the ranks, I mean, maybe get to be manager someday or supervisor or whatever, and not just be a slave, sweatshop person for the rest of your life,
Well, Cap, the first mistake that you're making in terms of analyzing how these corporations is looking at it is making the assumption that the corporations see these workers as human beings.
Well, that's exactly my point. I mean, anybody, my intention too. I mean, any time when I was, throughout my life when I had a job or whatever, I think it's in any normal person's mind. This is where you start. This is not where you want to be, in 5 or 10 years. You want to, have flexibility. I mean, you want to grow. You want your wages. You want more responsibility. And, the whole point of having a job, is to be seen as a valuable, asset, no matter what your position in the company is. Even if you're working in the mailroom, the idea is you should be able to move up.
Yeah, well, that is how someone who has a little bit of compassion and sees employment not just as a means to an end, but potentially as a vocation, and also wants to invest in their workforce and see people grow and see them get ahead. That's not Nike's intention.
Yeah.
The workers in their production plant, more than 171,000 of them just in Indonesia alone, more than 1.1 million of them globally, are nothing more than a line item to them. And it is the job of people at Nike and the corporate offices to drive down the cost of that line item, regardless of what that means in human terms, halfway around the world in places like Tangerang, Indonesia.
And so when you stayed there for that month, I know that was but you've been back to visit a bunch of times since then, and because I remember when I sat in on your presentation last year, you did talk about that they did win like some wage. They got increased wages. They did get some back pay or something for.
Yeah, we've won in the past 2 years. There have been two major cases that I advocated on that we were able to win. One was back in 2011 at Nike's PT Nicomas factory, where workers for 18 years were being cheated out of 2 to 3 hours of overtime pay every day.
Oh, it's just
and you do the back of the napkin calculations, and the number came out to about $100 million. We were able to get $1 million settlement. Now, it set precedent.
Wow.
And the practice has pretty much stopped in terms of forcing workers. And what they were having them do is punch out at the end of their shift, and then the line chiefs were forcing them to get back on the line and do another 2 or 3 hours a day. The problem we've had, when I was just in Indonesia 6 months ago, is in terms of the payouts, it's been an absolute mess. There were women workers. I met with a dozen factory workers, each of whom was due about 4.8 million rupiah in back wages. It's about $480 approximately. Some of them got paid as little as $10. And Nike's most recent response to me on that was that they consider this matter closed. Now, I can do my best in terms of trying to advocate from this end, but this is also a situation where those workers and the trade union that represents them has to decide whether or not they want to take some radical action to make sure that those workers get the justice that they deserve. If they do choose to do that, I will support them in any and every way that I can. Another case that we had just in January, the Indonesian government raised the minimum wage in January by about 40%. Most Nike factories were asking to be exempt from paying the new minimum wage. So there's one factory that the management was trying to get the union to sign off on this, because the unions have to do that under Indonesian law. And the union leadership refused. So what the management did was they sent in forged papers to the wage council for the wage exemption. They were strong-arming other workers to sign on to the deal. They brought in members of the Indonesian military to walk around the factory to pressure workers to sign off on this deal. So one of the trade unionists reached out to me. I went out there to Sukabumi, Indonesia, where this particular factory is. I documented all the facts of the case. I worked with one of our partners there, the Trade Union Rights Center in Jakarta. We organized a press conference, got international media to cover it. Within 3 days, Nike was committed to paying those workers a new legal minimum wage. And so, it's a small victory. Certainly it's not small, because it's worth $1 million to those 8,000 workers that are there. But in terms of the grand scope of things, it's a relatively small victory, and there's a lot more work to do day in and day out to get workers, not just with Nike, but for all these companies, the wages and the justice that they deserve.
And of course, I guess there's no punishment for Nike or any of these companies,
Absolutely not.
It sounds like it's pretty much just like anything else. If they get fined or anything at all, it's like chump change compared to, what they make.
And it's near impossible now, because of the revisions that were done with the Supreme Court, with the Alien Torts Claim Act, it's nearly impossible to even take for, a foreign national to take a U.S. corporation to court if their rights have been violated. In the past, again, you could have filed a claim under the Alien Torts Claim Act, and you'd have you might have a shot. Now that there's no legal mechanism to bring in these rogue corporations that are doing horrible things to people all around the world. That in itself is wrong. But even if you look at this, even if, let's say, you're a little more libertarian, or you're more, lean politically more conservative. There are security issues that need to be taken into consideration with how these corporations act. When you have U.S.-based transnational corporations that are exploiting people in countries that have political, social, and religious volatility, that can lend itself to building and breeding anti-American sentiment.
Yeah.
So even if you want to look at this from a completely self-interested standpoint, having Nike as a de facto ambassador for us in Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, and having them do the things that they do to the economically poor and marginally educated workers that they have, you're building a powder keg.
I just started to think, because just recently, the 29-year-old Edward Snowden, who came out against the NSA, who, he was working, he's 29 years old, getting paid like, $200,000 a year, working for like the CIA, the company, the National Security Administration, and he
Yep.
kind of, he's like the latest whistleblower, kind of coming out, on how they're like really invading the privacy of Americans, and I'm really grateful to these people who, they're right. I mean, they have at least some kind of conscience, like that they're not they're not going to just keep taking the $200,000, the house in Hawaii and everything else that they have, and giving that up, to expose this stuff, and then then you wonder about, right, like people, not only like the top guy at Nike, who you confronted in your your documentary, but also everyone that works at these companies that are more than happy to just take their salaries, for them to just believe that this is the way that it has to be, and that it has to be this way, that we have to make our money and live like these, and they're willing to live like their lifestyles, all at the same time, while like living off the backs of these people in these sweatshops, or like this guy, had he not said anything, could have been like, whatever, like living high off the backs of, America's, like, Americans' privacy being invaded. And, I mean, it's just, it just amazes me, like, like people are, we're all building the kind of a world that, we want to live in. And I guess people, they don't really mind living in and creating a world where, right, they're just living off of somebody else's back.
Yeah, Kata, unfortunately, the dynamics are not new. I mean, these are biblical issues in a sense.
Yeah.
That the exploitation of the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, the dispossessed, the unwashed, the unwanted, by a relatively small elite class of people has been going on in our human family for thousands and thousands of years.
Ridiculous.
It's just now that it's global. And the intensity with which it is happening is much more significant because of our globalized economy, because of the size of the population, our global population, which breeds when you have a limited set of resources, and more of it being polarized to the top and less of it being spread on the bottom. And when you add more people to that mix, you got a real mess of a world in terms of how our global economy is structured.
That's why, I mean, it really is important, for the people need to know where their stuff comes from. I mean, again, like, we just had a Monsanto march, like, I think it was like this, country nationwide, maybe even international march against Monsanto. And, I mean, because people don't even know what they're eating. I mean, people are not even aware. I mean, animals like where the stuff that you buy in the supermarket, the beef, the chicken. It's like, where does all this stuff come from? I mean, is it even real food half the time? And not enough people are aware. Where their clothing is made. Not just like what it's made out of, the material that it's made out of, but who is making it, and how much are they getting paid? I mean, I was getting to a point where I mean, I don't even go shopping anymore because I don't want to buy. I'm over here racking my brains. I'll stand there, for whatever, a half an hour, over which shampoo to buy because I want to make sure that it's not animal tested is really up high there on the list for me. Animal abuse and harming animals is really one of my things that hits my heart really strong. And
Kat, when you're doing that kind of stuff, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't support companies that are trying to do things that are more socially conscious than others, but you're really just nibbling around the edges.
Exactly.
The entire system needs to be called into question. And, capitalism is an inherently flawed system. It needs the poor to eat up and grind up, to churn out the profits, again, for a relatively small group of people. Now, what's unfortunate is that many times when people discuss these issues, particularly on the political left, in fact, I was just listening to a radio program this morning, and I was listening to Howard Stern here in New York City, and he had Russell Brand, the comedian, on. And Russell was talking about a demonstration he was at. It was an anti-capitalist demonstration. And Howard was open to listening, and he said, what's the alternative? We're going to go to communism and blah, blah, blah. And the conversation went on, and Russell didn't have a really good answer back. And it always frustrates me as someone who's an activist that there are so many on the left who don't stop people at that point in the conversation and say that it doesn't have to go, the pendulum doesn't have to swing from capitalism to communism, which we've really never seen in anywhere in the world. The closest we got was maybe in Nicaragua in the 80s, and the Sandinistas got wiped out. But China is not communism. That's totalitarian crony capitalism. Cuba is not communism. So we have to be able to articulate a better vision for people that isn't just hey, buy this shampoo or don't buy that shampoo. We on the whether you're right, left, or center, if you're frustrated with how our global economy and our global political system, and we do have a global political system, whether we like to believe it or not, it's a corporate oligarchy, is operating. We need to have an alternative, and we need to fight for that alternative and be willing to die, and I mean that literally, in the fight for that alternative.
I am glad you said that because I absolutely believe that that's what it's going to come down to. And I'm sorry, there was something that you said I wanted to refer to, even though I forgot what it was. But you said that the world needs poor people, and that's exactly right. And I also wanted to address what you just said too about this comedian being on the Howard Stern show. Why does it have to be at either ends of the spectrum? Because the bottom line is we don't have capitalism. We have complete psychopath capitalism. It's not a healthy capitalism.
Well, there is no healthy capitalism. You can have a healthy free market-based system that has social controls on it, but capitalism in and of itself, the logic of a capitalist economic system is to maximize profits regardless of the cost to humanity or nature. It ends up being a cancer that eats everything. That's what cancers do.
So then we can't, then we can't have it because it is unnatural. I mean, profit is nothing more than just extraction from, what doesn't exist. In nature, everything is balanced, you don't have one organ of your body when your body's going through its normal functioning, one organ of the body is looking to profit off the rest of the system. Of course, that would be considered a cancer, and it would throw your whole body system out of balance, and that's considered illness. So I like that's what I just don't get. I mean, the monetary system is nothing but a man-made, synthetic GMO fake system. And I mean, of course, like these people that, they think it's working for them. I mean, even these people that have like all this money think that it's working for them. But in reality, I don't think that it really is. I mean, like you could have a drug addict thinking like being a drug addict is working for them. But in reality, it really isn't, because when you're sick, you can't see that you're like a psychopath when you're a psychopath,
Absolutely. Now, one of the challenges that we have, clearly the analysis that you've done on the issue is broad and it's deep, as is the analysis that I've done on this issue and others. There are billions of people that are not awakened to these realities, that are not awakened to this kind of analysis, that don't see, what at the moment is a relatively slow-moving train heading towards destruction that's picking up steam on multiple fronts, whether it's an economic collapse, like we've seen in the United States with the housing collapse a number of years ago, whether it's an environmental collapse like we saw, right where I live here with, the most powerful hurricane that ever hit the eastern seaboard with Hurricane Sandy, or whether it's a building collapse like we saw in Bangladesh that crushed 1,200 workers.
Yeah.
The system and its inherent imbalances are accelerating at an alarming rate. And we people like yourself and myself have a tremendous responsibility to go out there and to educate as best we can. That's why, the nonprofit that I started when I got involved in doing this work and saw the direction it was taking my life is called Educating for Justice. So one of the mistakes that activists tend to make is that we assume a baseline of knowledge for everyday people. That is not the baseline of knowledge they have.
Exactly.
Just in the course of this, half an hour conversation that you and I have had, I've talked about, authoritarianism and crony capitalism in China. You've talked about GMOs. For most people, and I'm not judging them. It's just where we are at. They're talking about, who's winning American Idol, and how their favorite sports team is doing. Yeah. So we have to be able to enter their world. To find those entry points, the places that or the things rather, and topics that they're interested in, and find a way to raise these critical questions with them, to raise the consciousness. And so we build a critical mass of people that is calling into question the entire system. One of my long-standing frustrations with my fellow activists is that they live in a vacuum. And they think that, the half a dozen people who are sitting around the beat-up office in the East Village in New York City represent the entire world. And they can't understand why nobody else gets it. Well, if nobody else gets it, it's because you did a horrible job communicating it, whatever it is. And that's why I start, my lecture programs out that I do. I do a program called Behind the Swoosh, Sweatshops and Social Justice. And I make the assumption walking into every lecture hall that no one in that room has any idea of what I am about to talk about.
Right. You have to really start like at the very basic level.
Every time. With every conversation, with every discussion group, with every lecture, with every radio program that you do, you have to assume a baseline of knowledge that is null.
Because you really do, like this is like kind of one thing that I'm sort of like a firm believer in. We all have to pretty much like start, from kindergarten, like all over again, like just learning a new way, to live. And there's no shame in that, because like I think sometimes like why people sort of shy away from that stuff is because they think it's too simple. Like they think, simplicity, like that, like how does simplicity have any, like it can't possibly have any impact, but yet that's exactly what has the most impact is the basics and the most simple, getting back to, just because the way that the crony capitalist system gets over on people is to keep things so complicated, is to keep your head spinning, and it keeps things at this really like, out of reach level, and people are killing themselves, trying to get somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and people get caught up in that. They think, like the harder something is, the more complicated it is, the more I can't understand it. Oh, it must be so great. And that's how people kind of get taken,
Well, you'd be very hard pressed to give you a very concrete example of that. You take like credit default swaps. And,
exactly. That's exactly where I was going.
If you were to sit outside of the big banks down on Wall Street and where the guys are trading those kinds of things, and ask the traders when they're leaving for the day, hey, let's sit down on a park bench. Can you explain a credit default swap to me and the financial mechanics that go into it and drive it? Most of those guys can't explain it. They just know what it gets for them on their balance sheet. And there's really, there's no wizard behind the curtain. Or if there is, it's a very small group of wizards, like the guys at Goldman Sachs.
I went to a really good talk. This is, months ago, sometime during the winter. This guy, Greg Smith, who wrote a book called Why I Left Goldman Sachs. And, I have, his videos are on my YouTube channel. And the theme, that he basically was talking about, throughout his talk was, how complicated it was, and if people, the client thinks it's too complicated for them to understand, and to me, that's, that's when, the red flags should go up in someone, because it doesn't matter if it's a doctor, it doesn't matter if it's your, your stockbroker, it doesn't matter if it's your car mechanic. If the person in the know doesn't break things down in, in terminology that you can understand, that the client can understand, if they're not willing to do that, that should be the signal that sends you running in the other direction, not like, oh, it's too difficult for me to understand, let me not bother and just, here's my money, you do it,
Sure. Well, and that plays out, and even, the issue that we started talking about that I've been working on for the last 15 years with the Nike sweatshop issue. And I'll have, at times I'll be dealing with economics professors and they'll talk to me about the complexities. And I'll say, it's really not that complex. If you take a $75 pair of sneakers, those cost Nike $16.25 to produce. The labor cost was $2.43. If we want to triple workers' wages, you have to add another roughly $5 to the cost of the shoes, and you pass that cost on to consumers, and the shoe's going to go from $75 a pair to $80. And you disclose to consumers that the reason they're paying an extra $5, if Nike wasn't willing to absorb any of those costs, is so that we can lift a couple of million people out of poverty. It's a pretty easy solution. And there's a company that's actually started to do it, and I've got to run soon, but I want to tell you, the listeners, about this one company called Alta Gracia, and you can find them online at Alta Gracia Apparel, AltaGraciaApparel.com, AltaGraciaApparel.com. And they're doing it right. They're paying their workers 3 times the minimum wage at their production plant that they own down in the Dominican Republic, and they're making a difference along with making a dollar. The other thing I want to encourage listeners to do is to learn more about our campaign. The campaign is called Team Sweat, and they can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Team Sweat or on Twitter at Team Sweat. And I'd love to have all the people that are listening to the program today to like our page and to share it with their friends. There's a lot of resources on there that they can share with people to learn about the issue. I'd particularly encourage them, if they go to YouTube as well, do a search for Team Sweat, they could find a short documentary that I produced on this issue called Behind the Swoosh. And that's something really easy and simple that people can do, one, in watching it to learn more about the issue for themselves, and then 2, to educate others about it is just by cutting and pasting that link on your Facebook page, your Twitter feed, or dropping it in an email and sending it out to all your friends and family.
Can I just make this one quick point before you go?
Sure. Absolutely.
Again, you said the capitalism needs poor people. Just recently on Friday, the premiere of the documentary Dirty Wars was here in New York City. and they had a Q&A after the movie with Dr. Cornel West and, the maker of the film, war investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill. And towards the end of the Q&A, the point pretty much that Jeremy Scahill left, he pretty much like left people hanging with this, this reality that there is no end because, the war, to what he found out is exactly like you're saying. Like, they need there to be enemies. They need there to be terrorists. Like, because for every innocent family that the military kills, by accident or whatever, they're creating, more. So, when I say terrorists, I'm, quote unquote, what the powers that be want us to believe are terrorists, and so it's sort of like along the same lines of, for this business of war to continue and for them to profit, they need to keep creating terrorists.
Absolutely. It is when you are dealing with a capitalist economic system, everything gets commodified. The logic of the system is to commodify everything. So in the military-industrial complex, you need fodder for the cannons. And in the modern context, that fodder is Islamic terrorists. So they need them to keep the machine going, in the same way that Nike needs uneducated workers and uneducated consumers to keep the machine going, to continue to maximize their profits for a relatively small group of people. So look, we can sit around. I like to take the approach of spending 10% of my time doing the analysis on a problem and 90% of my time trying to fix it. So I want to encourage all the listeners out there to, certainly could use a little more time maybe to learn a bit more about the issue. And again, they can do it on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Team Sweat. They can check us out on Twitter @Team Sweat. And then get engaged. And I put up on a pretty regular basis things that people can do to help advocate for workers. And in our, one small campaign to try and make a difference in the lives of the people that make the clothes and shoes that we all enjoy buying and wearing here in the West. So I want to thank you for having me on the show today. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to coming back in the future.
Okay, thanks so much, and I'm glad to have you back.
All right, have a great day.
Okay, you too.
Bye.
We're going to try to go to a break now. I'm just kind of waiting for a signal for that to happen. Until I get the signal for, if we're going to go to a break shortly, I am just going to, we're going to go to a song now. Okay, we're back after the break, and we have just about 10 minutes left of the show. I wanted to play maybe just a little bit longer than a 5-minute video of the Q&A after the New York City premiere of the documentary Dirty Wars. There's Dr. Cornel West and Jeremy Scahill, and there's an audience member at the beginning of the video. An audience member is asking Jeremy Scahill about a independent journalist, like what we would consider like a no-name journalist who has been arrested, and he was to be released, but the leader of that country got in touch with, Obama told this leader of this country not to release this journalist. And that's the question that this woman is asking at the beginning of this video. So we'll go to that right now.
The question was about the Yemeni journalist Abdullah Haider Shaya, who we see is in prison in the film. He remains in prison right now, and he released. They smuggled a message out of prison last week from him, and he said in his message, "I don't want people to say that the Americans are holding me in prison. I want them to know that there's only one person who's responsible for me being in prison, and it's President Barack Obama." And he thanked journalists. He said, I've been told that there are journalists, including from America, who've been raising the issue of my case. And he said, I thank them. And someone else who went to visit him in prison recently said that he was aware of the reporting that we were doing on him. And that it was one of the things keeping him going, the idea that people outside of Yemen actually cared about his case. But this should be a stain on our society, the idea that the Nobel Peace Prize winning constitutional law professor, Democratic president, is keeping a journalist in Yemen in prison by simply picking up the phone and telling the president of another nation, we want your citizen to remain in your prison. And I think it's shameful that the media outlets that he did work for, they were happy when he was printing them sensational stories, when he was providing them with sensational stories, interviews with al-Qaeda leaders in Yemen. ABC News, Washington Post, NBC News all ran that journalist's work. None of them have said anything about his imprisonment. It's shameful. I asked one journalist at one of those networks, at one of those media outlets, why don't you speak up for Abdullah al-Haider Shaya? And he said the White House called us and told us that he's using the money we pay him to fund al-Qaeda operations. Now, anyone who's worked with local journalists in other countries know American journalists are some of the cheapest in the world and don't pay these people anything. So if that's al-Qaeda's fundraising operation, then they've got a sorry fundraising operation if they're depending on that journal. And he is a real journalist. If you actually take the time to read his journalism, far more critical than those yahoos in the front row at the White House press corps who play super soaker at Joe Biden's house and laugh at drone jokes that the White House correspondents do.
I talk about Julian Moore's instant classic, powerful, and I hear number 5 already on the New York Times bestseller list, is dedicated to journalists. Killed in battle, pursuing truth, and in prison. And that's very important given the low quality of so much of journalism these days.
I'm sorry, we've got time for one more question.
I have a question. Thank you for this. Given what's happening about Manning, Julian Assange, the surveillance issues coming out, and all what's happening to the criminalization of all the whistleblowers in America, I'm just curious, aren't you scared for yourself and what's happening in the future of journalism if this is the trend we're looking at and these people are in jail without any rights? Are you next?
Well, I would say thank you for that question, except I'm not thankful for it. Look, I mean, I think, I don't mean to make light of it. Part of the reason I feel embarrassed when people ask me that is that I know actual brave reporters. I leave those countries and go back to the land of baby strollers and lattes in Park Slope, Brooklyn, while my colleagues from all of these countries are in the line of fire. One of our colleagues in Somalia was shot multiple times. He was put in a prison that the U.S. is supporting in Mogadishu as an act of intimidation to tell him, if you film these operations again, this is going to become your new home. There are journalists missing in Syria right now. The record numbers of journalists are being killed around the world, and the vast majority of them are not American correspondents. They are unfamous journalists who are often toiling away, doing the daily beat journalism, oftentimes partnering up with more famous journalists who get the byline, and they're lucky if they get a little afterthought there. So when people ask me, about am I worried about something, I'm worried about them. And I get invited on cable news shows, and I am at far less risk than my friends and colleagues around the world. But I think everyone that's doing this kind of reporting right now, whether they're for the Associated Press or they're independent journalists, we're suing. I'm a plaintiff in suing to try to end the secrecy in the Bradley Manning proceedings. Anyone who's doing this now is in the sights of the government, and they're in people's emails. They're in your phone records. What's been revealed by Glenn Greenwald and others over these past few days about the extent of the national security state. Many of us already, I think, suspected that this was happening, but the stakes are very high right now. And if there is not a collective uprising against this, if people don't stand united, whether you're journalists or you're just concerned citizen, then it's going to continue. It's easy to be against these policies when a cartoonish villain like Cheney or Bush is in power. Your real principle is tested when someone like President Obama is in power. That's when, if you have the audacity to stand up under a Democratic administration, then you actually have a principle. Then it's not just checking your conscience at the coat check of the Obama presidency and then picking it back up the next time a Republican is in office. You have to be the same person if it's a principle. So, I admire those people that have the bravery and courage to stand up in dark times like these. And unfortunately, they have to be able to bring people out in the rain, and they need to come into this theater, which is why we have to cut it.
We admire this brother. We admire this brother here.
Thanks all for being here. I just want to remind you that
So that was Jeremy Scahill speaking about the independent journalists that live in these places like Yemen, who, speaking particularly of the one journalist who is still in jail, basically for just, doing the job. And so, just to piggyback off of the conversation that we were, having with Jim Keady, I mean, the reality that everything is commodified in this life. So, we don't even have like journalists anymore. I mean, there's absolutely, no one is allowed to just, speak freely, tell the truth, without being silenced for doing so. Whether you're this independent journalist in Yemen, or, I mean, even, the Occupy movement, what's going on in Turkey, the heavy hand of, I call it, just crony capitalism, but it's even more than that. I mean, it's gone to just, it's in the fourth stage of cancer. I mean, we have to recognize that and really, really accept that we are living in a very, very unhealthy world. And, money is not going to save us. And the people with the most power and money are out of control. And I'm going to, go out quoting, Gerald Celente, who's, he said it, and I junkies, they're junkies. I mean, nothing gets over on nature. Ultimately, the natural world is in control, and people with power and money are not in charge, and they cannot play God, even though that's exactly what, they have done. And so we'll be back next week, I believe 7 p.m. on Tuesday, every Tuesday. Thank you so much for listening, and stay organic.
You're listening to Awake Radio. Straight talk for the awake and aware.